On the edge of the wild frontier, a young mother had given birth to a baby girl alone in a freezing log cabin. But instead of joy, her husband had turned his back, furious it wasn't a boy. He had never held the child, never spoken her name. For 2 years she had endured his silence, his rage, and his cruelty, until one snowy night he had raised his hand toward their daughter. That was the last time. She had run barefoot into the storm, her baby in her arms. What happened next made hearts stop and stand. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? They told her it was a blessing to marry a strong man on the frontier, a provider, a protector, a man who could carve a life out of the wilderness. But no one warned Ruth Whitlow what it would cost her soul, because the moment she gave birth in that cold log cabin, her body trembling, sweat freezing on her skin, and her arms cradling the tiny crying infant swaddled in her grandmother's quilt, her husband Eli didn't come to kiss her forehead or hold the child. He stood at the door, fists clenched, and growled, "But I wanted a son," like it was a betrayal, not a birth. Like she had failed him by giving life to a girl instead of a boy who could carry his name and plow his fields and wield a rifle someday in his image. And from that moment, everything changed. The warmth left his eyes. His footsteps grew louder, his hands heavier, and the cabin colder, and Ruth, still bleeding from childbirth, still aching from hours of pain, watched him leave without touching the baby once, saddle his horse, and ride into town like she hadn't just fought for both their lives. The days turned hard after that. Not from the weather, which was always cruel, or the hunger, which came often, but from Eli's silence, his contempt, the way he stared through their daughter like she didn't exist, and when the baby cried at night, Ruth had to hush her quickly, terrified he'd wake and rage, not from stress or fatigue, but from spite, because he didn't want her, didn't love her, and didn't forgive Ruth for it. And still Ruth endured, nursed her child, sang lullabies through chapped lips, and worked the hearth alone while Eli drank more, worked less, and muttered things under his breath that made even the crows grow quiet on the roof. When spring came and the land softened, Ruth had hoped he might soften too, might touch his daughter's cheek while she slept, might notice her laugh, the tiny fingers gripping his old rifle strap like it was a toy. But no, he only sneered, spat, and said, "A boy would be walking already." And Ruth wanted to scream, to break dishes, to run. But where could a woman go in a place where the next neighbor was 10 miles off, and the law didn't ride past unless someone was dead? So she stayed and every day prayed a little harder. Not for love, but for strength. And strength she found not in Eli's arms, but in her own, hauling water, chopping kindling, mending fences with the baby tied to her back, humming to keep her mind from fracturing, because deep down she knew one day he would go too far. And that day came when she found her daughter, sweet Eliza, barely crawling, reaching for a rusted hunting knife on the table, the same knife Eli had left unsheathed while sharpening it drunk. And when Ruth yelled, he only rolled his eyes, said, "Maybe she'll do me a favor and cut herself out of the picture." And that night Ruth didn't sleep, didn't blink, just stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind and wondering what kind of man could look at his own blood and feel nothing. And when he slapped Eliza's hand away the next day for grabbing a spoon, Ruth saw red, not anger but clarity, and she stepped between them, for the first time raising her voice, saying, "Touch her again, and I swear by every bone in my body I'll make you regret it." And he laughed like a wolf, mocking, towering over her with that false strength born of cruelty. But she didn't flinch, didn't back down, because something inside her had shifted, something ancient and immovable, and he must have seen it too, because he lowered his hand and muttered, "She's still worthless," before storming out, slamming the door so hard it cracked, and for a week he didn't come back. And Ruth prayed he never would, but of course he did, reeking of whiskey and rage, riding in with the storm, demanding to know why his stew was cold and why Eliza had his old coat on, screaming about respect and obedience and how the Lord gave him dominion, And when Ruth told him she feared no man who used scripture as a weapon, he threw the bowl against the wall and reached for her. But this time she didn't cower. She grabbed the fire iron, planted her feet and told him to try it, just try it, and he didn't. Maybe because he was too drunk, or maybe because he knew that if he touched her again, something in her would break and take him with it. After that, Ruth began hiding coins, sewing them into Eliza's blankets, saving food under the floorboards, and visiting the neighboring widow, Mrs. Clancy, under the excuse of trading eggs, but really to ask about train schedules, ticket prices, and safe towns where a woman could disappear and start over, because Ruth was done praying for Eli to change, done waiting for kindness that would never come. And when Eliza turned 2, Ruth made her choice. She packed a satchel, bundled her daughter, and waited for nightfall, heart pounding so loud it drowned the crickets. And just when she thought freedom was near, a bootstep creaked behind her, and Eli's voice, slow and venomous, said, "You think you're leaving with my daughter?" And that word "my" broke her, because he had never kissed her, never rocked her, never stayed up with her fever, never even remembered her birthday, and now he dared to claim her. And Ruth turned, fire in her chest, and said, "She is not yours, she's mine, and I will not let her rot under your roof." And he lunged, hands grabbing her arm, but she slammed the door into his face, bolted it, and ran out the back into the snow, barefoot and breathless, carrying Eliza as dogs barked and horses neighed, and her own heartbeat nearly deafened her. She didn't stop until she reached the widow Clancy's barn, and together they waited till morning, when the sheriff arrived, not for Ruth, but for Eli, because days earlier, she'd sent a letter detailing every bruise, every threat, every neighbor who'd seen him drunk and heard him scream. And when the sheriff cuffed him, Eli roared like a wounded animal, spitting and snarling. But the townsfolk just watched, not with pity but relief, because everyone had known and no one had spoken. And now Ruth stood holding her daughter as the man who once owned everything was dragged away by the law he thought would never come for him. Weeks later, Ruth and Eliza boarded a train heading west, not to run but to start again. And on that ride, Ruth wept, not from sadness, but from the kind of release that only comes when you realize you were never weak, just surviving. And as Eliza slept with her head on Ruth's lap, Ruth whispered, "You will never know fear the way I did. I swear it," and she meant it, with every bone in her body, every scar on her soul, because she had birthed more than a daughter. She had birthed a future where love was not earned through silence and survival, but built on tenderness and choice. And for the first time in her life, Ruth looked out the window, saw the horizon, and smiled.